what you're doing can make a huge impact on decreasing challenging behaviors and teaching those positive, pro-social, communicative behaviors in its place, which I think we all want to do, right? So first off, all behavior is learned. We've probably heard that before, but let's dive in a little bit to what that really means. So that means that what happens around our behavior determines if we want to do it more often. So think back to when one of your children, or if you aren't a parent, if you have nieces or nephews or friends with kids, the first time they take their first step or they say a word, the parents like throw a party. They're like, oh my gosh, that's so great. So the little toddler wants to do it again and again to get that praise. Or if your child says a bad word, you might laugh. Like maybe if you're the kind of parent I am, the first time your kid says a bad word, you laugh. And then you're like, oh my God, now I'm reinforcing this behavior. And soon your kid is running off to preschool saying bad words and you've got some work to do. We learn this as adults. Think about the movie Ferris Bueller. He learns how to not go to school. He learns how to fake being sick. He fakes a stomach cramp. He moans and wails. He does the whole bit. So his parents think he's sick and he doesn't have to go to school, and it works. So he does it again and again. So behaviors that result in something awesome are something we want to keep doing. We want to do it again and again. We learn that things that result in something awesome, and we learn what things don't result in something awesome. So on the reverse, we also learn what behaviors do not result in something awesome, and we avoid or stop doing those things. So if you have ever touched something really hot, you probably only had to do it one time because you learned, hey, touching a hot iron is not awesome. I am not going to do that again. If you say a joke and no one laughs, it's awkward and it's quiet, you are not going to say that joke again because you're like, ooh, no one thought that was funny. I guess I'm not going to do that again. So reinforcement plays an important role in the behaviors we do on a daily basis. It might seem simple and straightforward, but it can get complicated quite quickly. So in tonight's workshop, we're going to explore what can go wrong with reinforcement and how to make sure that you're using reinforcement correctly. So you may be thinking, okay, this all sounds great, but at the end of the day, I'm most worried about getting rid of or decreasing negative behaviors that are dangerous, behaviors that are disruptive, behaviors that are impeding my child's learning. Well, don't worry, we are going to get to that. Before we get to the rest of our session, a little bit more about me. I am the parent of 3 kids, 2 girls and an 8.5-month-old little boy. I was a special education teacher for 10 years in a self-contained classroom. And like mentioned before, I have my master's in applied behavior analysis. I now run the Autism Helper, where we have a blog with a blogging team of about 8 people. We have an SLP, an OT, a parent, and then teachers from preschool all the way through junior high. We now have a professional development membership group where we give ongoing training to parents, educators, and clinicians. We have 2 online courses, and we create curricular resources for teachers and parents for their kids that are on the spectrum. So when we're talking about decreasing negative behaviors, we definitely want to obviously see less of those behaviors that are disruptive or dangerous. And we can really decrease negative behaviors by increasing positive behaviors. When we're looking at behavior change, we really want to focus on the good stuff more. Our goal is to build up those positive behaviors and see more and more and more of them. So naturally, those negative behaviors decrease. If we focus our time and our energy more on the good stuff, we're going to have more success overall on decreasing negative behaviors. And that's not maybe your first instinct or your first reaction. Our first reaction is to go towards those negative behaviors, but we really want to flip the script and focus on building up the good that's there. And by doing that, those negative behaviors will decrease. And to this whole process, reinforcement is key. This is the key to positive behavior change. It's the key to decreasing negative behaviors. It's key to increased inclusion opportunities, and it's key to learning new academic, social, and functional skills. Reinforcement is probably the topic I talk about the most. Every single session I do, whether it's about behavior change, data, academics, literacy, reinforcement sneaks its way in there because it's part of everything I talk about. It's part of academic learning. It's part of social skills. It's part of decreasing negative behaviors. So having a really good understanding of reinforcement is going to impact all of these areas. So now reinforcement might seem really simple. You're like, okay, cool. We'll just add something awesome to all positive behaviors that my child is doing and move on. But let's dig a little deeper. So it might seem simple, but what is something awesome? What's awesome to me may not be awesome to you. And I guarantee that's what is awesome to your child is not the same thing as what's awesome to you. Your child may love rewatching the same 15 seconds of SpongeBob over and over and over again. And you have those 15 seconds memorized, and those 15 seconds drive you crazy. But for your child, he's living for that. That's all he wants. That's his something awesome. Reinforcement might seem simple, but when do we give the something awesome? Is it right away? Is it all the time? Is it some of the time? The waters get a little murky there. How often do we give it? And what if they're engaging in a negative behavior? What do I do then? So we're going to kind of break down exactly how to approach all of these questions. What is the something awesome? When are we giving it? How are we giving it? And what do we do when we don't see that many positive behaviors? And how can we build that up? So let me tell you a little story here before we really dig in. So storytelling time. And this story is called, I Don't Negotiate, Except That I Do. So following your own advice as a teacher or a clinician or a therapist is a lot easier when you're giving advice than when you are following the advice. Now, before I had kids, I was an educator, I was a behavior analyst, and I was like, I knew the right answers to do things, and you should put your kids to bed this way, and you should do toilet training this way, and you should follow these steps. And then when you have your own kid, you're like, oh, how do I do those things again? It's a lot harder when it's your own child. Sometimes from the other side of the fence, we don't see everything that's going on and how hard implementing strategies can really be. I think having kids was a very humbling moment for me as a behavior analyst, because I was like, oh my gosh, the expectations that I had for parents were just not possible. So there's two very different things, knowing what to do and then actually doing it. So back in the day, I had my first child. She was all cute and adorable and she didn't talk yet. She couldn't talk back. I could put her in a stroller. It was great. And I was like, man, I'm going to be this strict parent, and I don't negotiate with terrorists or toddlers. I'm going to be the boss. Now, fast forward about maybe a year and a half after that, and we have adorable tantruming child. And I'm pretty sure this picture was taken because we wouldn't give her a popsicle at 6:30 in the morning. Such mean parents. Now, I don't know if you guys ever feel this way, but before going to work, before going to school, that's when the tantrums seem to come. That's when behavior problems seem to come. And it feels like there's this huge countdown timer, like in the movies, something's about to explode when everyone's about to be late. The bus is about to come. You have to leave for work at a certain time. You have to leave for daycare at a certain time. And that timer is getting closer and closer to that time. And that's how I felt a lot, when we had our first child and we had to go to work at a certain time, and she had to get to daycare at a certain time, and problems started happening. And what did we do? We had to get her out the door. So we negotiated, right? She would have big tantrums, and we did whatever we could to get her out the door. And tantrums kept occurring, and they kept escalating. And I thought at the time that maybe I was doing the right thing because I was trying to hold out what she was originally tantruming for. If she wanted to bring her little babies to school or whatever thing she wanted to wear this out. No, you can't do that. But I ended up negotiating, and maybe she didn't get the first thing she wanted. She didn't get the popsicle at 6:30. But she ended up getting so many other things because we negotiated. So there was one morning where, right, she went to daycare, and she went to daycare wearing goggles as a headband, bringing my electric toothbrush and eating a huge, like Costco sized bag of goldfish. And that's how she went to daycare. And we had this whole long morning. My husband brings her to daycare, comes back, and he looks at me and he's like, I think we need a behavior plan for her. And I was like, that is the most attractive thing you've ever said. I absolutely think we need a behavior plan for her. So we sat down and thought about it like a little bit more objectively. And we're like, okay, what's really going on here? And what happened was that bribery was winning. We were using bribery to get the negative behavior to stop and to get positive behaviors to start. Her behavior had snowballed from something small to something big because of bribery. So what was happening is the behavior was starting small. What was happening here was whining. Her whining started, we said no, she started whining a little bit louder, and she got what she wanted. Well, that snowball started growing. She starting off with loud whining. Well, we would say no, and then she'd have a small tantrum, and she got what she wanted. Well, it snowballed even more. She would just start right with a small tantrum. We'd say no. Now it would go to a big tantrum, and she would get what she wanted. So what started as something pretty small snowballed pretty quickly to something bigger. So we needed a new plan. Her behavior had snowballed from small to big because of bribery. Bribery was a Band-Aid. It was getting her out the door, but it was not working. And it was actually making the behaviors worse in the long run. So there's a book I really love. It's kind of old school. It's called The Power of Positive Parenting by Glenn Latham. And there's a chapter in this book about tantruming and about meltdowns. And so my husband had said, okay, we need a behavior plan. I was like, yes, I want you to read a chapter in this book. And he was like, are you kidding? And I was like, absolutely not. Read a chapter in this book and then we'll talk. And what I really like about the chapter in this book about meltdowns and tantruming and looking at this whole kind of issue of snowballed behavior is this one phrase that was taught in this book. When you act that way, you don't get to be around me. And it's not telling a child, I'm going to ignore you. It's not ignoring a child. It's not just walking away and like doing nothing, but it's saying something simple and saying, hey, the way you're acting right now, I don't love, and I don't want to be around that. And to me, I like this statement because it's simple and it's also really showing natural contingencies, because in life,
hey, get on this.
There are people that you don't want to be around, right? So quick example, let's think about maybe people that you work with. So maybe you work with someone who's a gossip and they talk all the time about everyone. Maybe you work with someone who's the attention getter and they are just here for getting all the attention all the time. Or the complainer, the one who always has everything the worst, or the one-upper. Actually, they have everything the worst. If you work with these people and they call you on the weekend to hang out, you probably don't want to hang out with them, right? You're like, ooh, I don't want to be around that. I don't like that right now. So we needed to really change bribery to reinforcement. We had to change the contingency. So awesome things, mom and dad's attention, break, toys, came after positive behaviors instead of before positive behaviors. So this is a tool in your toolbox. When we think of positive behavior change, there is no one size fits all solution. So how the tools are used is going to look very different for every student. So if the scenario that I talked through with my own daughter, you're like, that would never work for mine, it might not. You might have to use these tools differently. So let's kind of dive into the difference between bribery and reinforcement. Let me see, what time is it? Okay, I'm just making sure I'm on time. Difference between bribery and reinforcement. So reinforcement is something that comes after a behavior that increases the chance of that behavior happening again in the future. Key word here is after. Some examples. Student does really good work on their schoolwork and she gets good grades and praise from her teacher. Student coughs into his elbow. This is a very COVID appropriate example. His mom says, good job, and he avoids being scolded for not covering his mouth. A construction worker is holding up a stop sign when the rest of the crew is kind of digging into the street and doing some work on a busy street. The other construction worker holds up a stop sign to stop traffic coming one way, and people listen, the cars stop, and the other workers can do their jobs, and their coworkers are happy because they're not getting hit by a car. So remember, both positive and negative behaviors can be reinforced. So if a student is playing if students are fighting, they might escape playing a game that they don't want to play. If a student is cheating, they might win the game and they're more likely to cheat in the future. If a boy pulls a little girl's hair, he's going to get attention and a reaction from her. So he may be more likely to do that in the future as well. So both positive and negative behaviors are learned and reinforced. So what is bribery? Bribery is something that comes before a behavior in hopes that a desired behavior will come and or in hopes of stopping a negative behavior. So let's dig into that for a minute. So some examples of what bribery could look like. A student is crying because they lost the game, or a student is crying and you would say, oh, let's stop. Once you stop crying, let's go play a game. Johnny is upset going to school because he misses his mom, and mom's going to say, hey, look, I'm going to buy you your favorite donut if you promise me you'll do really good in school today. Here, you can have your donut right now, but promise me during school you're going to be really good. A student gets upset doing his work, and the teacher says, okay, let me help you with this so you can calm down. Now, bribery works, but then it doesn't. Some of those examples, you're like, oh, that's not so bad. But let's dig into how we can shift it just a little so we can have better long-term success. So in the moment, bribery is going to work. The girl's going to stop crying. The boy's going to stop crying. The child's going to kind of stop getting upset about his work. But what in the end have they all learned? They've all learned that crying, throwing your paper is going to get attention, a reaction, help, where instead we want positive, pro-social, communicative behaviors to get that response instead. So those negative behaviors are going to result in something awesome instead of the positive behaviors. So what are they likely to do in the future to get what they want? They're likely to engage in those negative responses again. So who else's behaviors are reinforced in these bribery scenarios? So in these bribery scenarios, the teacher or the parent also gets reinforcement because that negative behavior stops as a result of the bribe. So the teacher or the parent's more likely to use that bribe again in the future. So for my example, for my own child, when we gave the electric toothbrush and the goggles and the goldfish, the tantrum stopped. And she got to go to, we got to leave for daycare. We got to leave for work on time. So it becomes a little bit like this vicious cycle. So a negative behavior happens. The bribery stops. Let me move my thing a little bit. Bribery stops. The negative behavior in that moment. Oops. The child is more likely to use negative behavior in the future. The adult is more likely to use bribes in the future. So it kind of keeps going like that. So what happens when we try to stop this? Well, negative behavior happens and the adult does not provide the bribe, right? We're like, nope, I'm not doing this. You can't bring the electric toothbrush to school today. And what happens? The child escalates to something worse, to something louder, to something bigger. It's that snowballing that we talked about earlier. So in those moments, we get to a point where we have to provide the reinforcement. We have to provide that bribe there because we want to maintain safety, right? Sometimes things escalate to the point where we just have to intervene. Things aren't safe, or, we really do have to go to school. The bus is there. So we have to provide that bribe. And then it escalates that behavior where now students are going to start with that escalation behavior. And it's just going to keep growing and keep going and keep growing. So why does reinforcement work so much better? So let's look at it from the flip side. When a positive behavior happens, child receives reinforcement, child wants to do the positive behavior again, positive behavior happens again. I would much rather be in this circle where we're just increasing positive behaviors. It's really the difference of coercion versus cooperation. With bribes, the payoff is a begrudging compliance. But with reinforcement, the consequence encourages the individual to perform in similar ways in the future. So let's dive into 5 ways to know that you are using reinforcement, because a lot of these examples, it's such a small difference that it's a little bit confusing. So I'm going to go through these 5 ways to know you're using reinforcement. And I also have a handout for you at the end that kind of summarizes these 5 ways, which is helpful to kind of make sure that you're on the right track. So number 1 is the preferred item does not come until after you see the positive behavior. We have to have the order that way. Positive behavior, reinforcement. It has to be that way. You see more positive behaviors in the future. You know you're using reinforcement correctly when you're seeing more and more good stuff. Number 3, there's not a requirement of stopping a negative behavior. So we're not saying, hey, stop throwing a chair and come sit at the computer, right? There's not that requirement. The positive behaviors of the child are the only thing that benefits the adults, and there is minimal negotiation happening. So let's dig into each one. So number 1, this is the big one. Preferred item does not come until after you see the positive behavior. You need to see the behavior before the preferred item is given, not a promise of that behavior. This is in the ABA world called the Premack Principle, or grandma's rule. So first you eat your peas, then you get your dessert. So we want to see the eating the peas first, not, hey, don't worry, let me eat the chocolate cake first. I promise after I eat the chocolate cake, I will eat all my peas. No, we want to eat the peas first, then eat the chocolate cake. So this might be first, we're going to help mom, then we're going to watch TV. First, you're going to do your schoolwork, then you can play on the computer. You can show this kind of order of activities using a choice board or a token board saying, hey, we got to do 3 things, then you get your toy. It's really how the real world works, right? We get our paycheck after we do our job. Every 2 weeks, every other Friday, you get your paycheck for the job that was already done. What would happen if you went to your boss and you were like, hey, you know what? For the month of May, could you just pay me all right now? And I promise I will work all May. Don't worry. What would your boss say? No, your boss would be like, no, you need to work first and then I'll pay you, right? That's how the world works. What if you went to the grocery store, you went to Aldi and you filled up your grocery cart and you were like, you know what? I'm going to take all of these groceries home and I promise I'll come back and pay for it later. They would be like, no. You pay me, then you may take the groceries home. So we need to see that positive, that behavior coming first and then get the reinforcement there. So there's a lot of tools that we can use to show this. We can show this with token economies, with first then boards to show, hey, first work, then reinforcement. We want to show the order of things, how that's happening. So we might need to explain that to our kids, but we're still not giving them the reinforcer. We're just explaining it. So tools are showing that exactly what's going to happen. You're not giving them the preferred item. You're just telling them it's coming. One of my favorite little visuals is a super simple and easy one. And this is great for your kids that have lower receptive language processing. So maybe they just don't understand all of the words you are giving them. So if your student or your kid has a certain activity or a toy or a video that they really love, you can print a picture of it and cut it up into pieces. So this is with the iPad. Just cut up into pieces. And then every few minutes of appropriate behavior or every activity that they do, every household chore they do, they earn a piece of the puzzle. When they get the last one, they get the iPad. I had a client many years ago who was obsessed with the Wiggles. And I don't know if you guys know the Wiggles. I don't love the Wiggles. Like, sorry to them. These are the old Wiggles too. This is an old chart. But he would work we would go do a lot of his schoolwork and his chores using this visual. And he would get one of the little pieces of the puzzle for every chore that he helped mom with, for every part of his homework he did. When he got the last piece, he watched the Wiggles on the TV. And it was great. And don't feel bad for me not liking the Wiggles, because I'm pretty sure they're billionaires. So good for them. Okay, so next, number 2, you will see more of the positive behaviors in the future. The easiest way to know if you are using reinforcement and if reinforcement is working is you're seeing more good stuff happening. You're seeing more positive behaviors coming. If you're not seeing more positive behaviors, you want to look at if you are using reinforcement, if you are using bribery instead of reinforcement. You also want to make sure that preferred item is actually a reinforcer. You may be being like, hey, I'm going to give my child a sticker every time they do something good. And he's like, I don't want a sticker, right? It has to be something that's actually a reinforcer. And you want to make sure that the positive behavior you're asking them to do is something they know how to do. If you have a 5-year-old and you're like, hey, I need you to sit here and wait for 15 minutes while I cook dinner, just not moving, just sitting at the chair. Guess what? There is no 5-year-old that can sit for 15 minutes just waiting. There's very few adults that can sit for just 15 minutes without waiting. We engage in off-task behaviors when we wait. So we want to make sure that that positive behavior you're asking them to do is something that's in their skill set. Number 3, there is not often a requirement of stopping a negative behavior. So bribery typically circles around stopping a negative behavior and starting a positive behavior. So we are stopping a tantrum, we're stopping an aggressive behavior, we're stopping a fight, and then we're switching it to something positive. We want to catch them before the negative behavior starts. That's really the goal. We want to get them before they get there. We want to start catching all of those little opportunities of positive behaviors and building it up from there. What if, this is a question I get all the time, what if they're already engaging in negative behavior? What should I do? We want to then prompt for the positive behavior. Show them, hey, these are the great ways to get attention. If you need a break, this is how you can get a break. If you want the iPad or chicken nuggets, this is how you ask for it. And then you provide that reinforcement. And for the future, plan those proactive strategies for preventing problem behavior to use next time. Number 4, the positive behaviors of the child are the only thing that benefits the adults. Now, reinforcement does not need to directly benefit the adult. With bribery, there's a direct benefit to the adult because that negative behavior stops. But with reinforcement, the positive behaviors of the individual are the only thing that's benefiting the parent or the teacher. And number 5, there's no negotiation or minimal negotiation happening. Negotiation tends to come along with bribery because with bribery, you're kind of trying to get the best deal. So if they're like, no, you can have 10 cookies and your child's like, well, what number can we both be happy with, right? Now, negotiation is typically reinforced because even if a child asks for more and doesn't get that initial ask, he learns that, oh, maybe I got a little more, I got something different, so I'm going to keep doing that. Now, negotiating isn't always a bad skill. I actually think negotiation is a great life skill, self-advocate. Like when my own kids negotiate with me, it's hard in the moment. I'm like, oh, but I'm like, these are nice life skills to have. You are self-advocating, you're standing up for yourself, but it can escalate and we don't necessarily want it constantly happening. Negotiation doesn't tend to accompany reinforcement because if it's truly reinforcement and you've picked an item or activity that is really a reinforcement, there's no need to negotiate. So as long as something's actually a reinforcer and as long as the behavior you're asking a child to do is something they can do, you're good. So you want to focus more on completing that desired behavior, have the students focus more on completing the desired behavior than on negotiating. So what can you do? So really the next step is making a plan for using reinforcement over bribery and start thinking about the day-to-day interactions that you have with your own kids, with your students, and thinking about how you can shift that kind of conversation or that contingency at play from bribery to reinforcement. So how can you change little things so you're not always trying to stop a behavior and shift to a positive behavior, but instead start from those positive behaviors and build up there. So practice identifying just in your house. If you talk about this with your spouse or a family member, have them kind of calling you out. Is this a bribe? Is this reinforcement? Start practice identifying when bribery is occurring and when reinforcement is occurring in your own life. And work with, people around you to kind of do the same. It helps to kind of all be on the same page with starting to identify this. So I emailed a handout out that will get forwarded to you that has this kind of quick summary of those 5 ways that I just shared. I know I talk really fast, so apologies. I try to always fit a lot in. So definitely check out that handout. I think it's a nice quick way to review the difference between bribery and reinforcement and kind of keep you thinking about how different situations are at your own house. And I also sent out all the slides. So if you want to go back through the slides, you'll have access to those